The stagecoach lurched sideways on the icy grade above Larkspur Creek, and Olive Redmond felt the whole world tip before she heard the first gunshot. Snow had been falling since dawn, fat, unseasonable flakes that the driver had cursed at twice already, and the 6 horses were laboring against a grade slicked to glass. Then a rifle cracked somewhere in the rocks above the trail, and the lead team screamed and bolted sideways, and the coach went over with a sound like a barn falling down. Olive was thrown against the door, then against the ceiling, then against the door again, and for 3 or 4 seconds that felt like a year she could not tell which way was up. When the world stopped moving, she was lying against the window glass with her skirts tangled around her boots, and somewhere close by a woman was sobbing, and a man was shouting for someone to cut the traces before the horses dragged the whole wreck down the slope. "Hold still," Olive said, to herself as much as anyone, and found the door above her head instead of beside her, and shoved it open with both boots. Outside was chaos wrapped in white. 4 riders in dusters had come down off the rocks, faces wrapped against the cold and the recognition of witnesses both, and one of them was already hauling a strongbox down from the boot, while another kept a rifle trained on the driver. A graying man named Ezra Cobb, who knelt in the snow with his hands raised and blood running from a cut over his eye. "Get the boxes," one of the riders called out. "Leave the strongbox. It is the boxes we want." And Olive understood with a cold lurch that had nothing to do with the temperature that these men had not stopped the stage for money. There was a locked chest of cheap pine roped to the boot rail behind the strongbox, stenciled in black paint. BALLOTS, Copper Creek Precinct, Larkspur County Special Election. She had read enough about land companies and rigged county offices in the last 3 years to know exactly what a stolen ballot box was worth to the right men. There was an older passenger still trapped inside the overturned coach, a heavy-set drummer named Mr. Prout, who had talked her ear off about shoe leather for the better part of 2 days, and he was wedged beneath the collapsed seat with his leg caught at an angle that made her stomach turn. Olive dropped back down into the wreck rather than run, because running was for later, and began hauling at the seat frame with both hands. "It will not move," Mr. Prout gasped. "Miss Redmond, you had better save yourself." "I did not ride 400 miles to leave a man pinned in a ditch," she told him, bracing her boot against the door frame and pulling until her shoulders screamed, and the seat gave an inch, then 2. That was when she heard the second rider coming. Not from the rocks above, but down the trail behind them. A horse pushed hard through snow that would have broken a lesser animal's wind, and a man's voice cut across the wreck loud enough to carry over the wind. "Sheriff's office. Drop it and ride, or I will drop you where you stand." Olive knew that voice. She had known that voice since she was 11 years old, and it had been cracking through the awkward middle registers of boyhood, calling her name across the schoolyard fence, and hearing it now, deepened by 8 years and an authority she had never once imagined for him, sent a jolt through her chest sharper than the crash had. David Watkins came down off the rise on a big raw-boned bay, a Winchester across his saddle bow and his hat gone somewhere behind him in the snow. And he did not look like the boy who had once carved her initials into the loft beam of her father's barn. He looked like a man who had done this before and did not enjoy it. The riders at the ballot box scattered rather than fight a man with a rifle already leveled, one of them firing a wild shot back over his shoulder that took a chip out of the coach's paneling a foot from Olive's head, and then they were gone up into the rocks and the trees, hoofbeats fading into the hiss of falling snow. David swung down before his horse had fully stopped and went first to Ezra Cobb, checking the cut over his eye with 2 fingers, then to the wreck, and it was only when he crouched at the door and looked in that his eyes found Olive's face in the gloom. For a moment neither of them said anything at all. "Olive," he said finally, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not name. "Olive Redmond." "Sheriff Watkins," she said, because she needed the formality of his title to keep her hands from shaking. "I have a man trapped in here who needs a stronger back than mine." Whatever David Watkins had been about to say, he set it aside, and within 2 minutes he had the seat wrenched free with the leverage of his whole body and Mr. Prout dragged out into the snow, pale and swearing softly. His leg bent wrong, but not so badly it would not mend. Olive climbed out after, and only then, standing in the trampled snow with her hair coming loose from its pins and her hands scraped raw, did she let herself look at him properly. He had grown into his height. He had been a lanky, serious boy of 17 the last time she had seen him, all elbows and unfinished sentences, and now he stood with the settled weight of a man who had learned to carry a badge and a rifle and other men's fear of him without flinching. There was a scar through one eyebrow that had not been there before. His eyes had not changed at all, and that was somehow the hardest thing to look at. "You are supposed to be in Denver," he said, "writing for the newspapers." "I am writing for the newspapers," she said. "That is why I am here." Something tightened in his jaw, quick and involuntary, gone before she could be certain she had seen it. They got the ballot box, dented but unopened, and the strong box, and Ezra Cobb's cut eye bound with a strip torn from Olive's own petticoat. And between the 4 uninjured passengers and David's borrowed strength, they got the coach itself back up onto its wheels before the light failed entirely. It was full dark and the snow had thickened to a steady curtain by the time they came down into Larkspur, David riding alongside the limping coach the whole way with his rifle across his knees, watching the tree line, and Olive watching him. She had not expected to feel anything at all, coming back. She had told herself that for 3 years, ever since she had first begun hearing rumors in the Denver newspaper offices about a land company buying up water rights in a certain fertile valley under Rattlesnake Ridge, ever since her father's letters had begun arriving with that careful, frightened steadiness that she recognized from a man trying very hard not to worry his daughter. She had told herself she was riding into Larkspur County as a journalist and nothing more, that whatever she had left behind 8 years ago was buried as deep as the things she had come home to dig up. She had not expected David Watkins to still make her chest go tight like that, snow or no snow, badge or no badge. Larkspur by lamplight looked smaller than she remembered and shabbier, half its false-fronted buildings dark, the boardwalks rimed with ice. The stage rolled to a stop in front of the Larkspur house, and it was there, stepping down into the cold with her carpetbag in one hand, that Olive first heard her father's name spoken by a stranger in a tone that told her, before a single word of explanation, that something in her life had ended. The desk clerk at the Larkspur house was a thin young man named Tucker who went pale when she gave her name. "Redmond," he said. "Olive Redmond. You would be Elia's girl." "I am." He looked past her to David, who had followed her in out of the cold, and something passed between the two men, some silent negotiation about who should say the next thing and how. "Miss Redmond," David said, and his voice had gone very careful, the voice of a man who had delivered bad news before and hated it every time. "I think you had better sit down." She did not sit down. She stood very still with her hands still gripping the strap of her carpetbag, and she said, "Tell me." "Your father is dead," David said. There was no way to soften it, and he did not try to. 2 weeks passed, up at Copper Creek Camp. The lobby of the Larkspur house seemed to recede from her, the lamplight and the smell of wood smoke and wet wool, until there was only David's face in front of her, and his eyes, which would not look away from hers even though she could see how badly some part of him wanted to. "How?" she said. "There was trouble at the camp, a gathering that turned into a fight, shooting in the dark." He stopped. "I was there, Olive. I do not yet know everything that happened. But I was there, and I mean to know it all before I am through, and I promise you that." She heard, beneath the careful sheriff's language, something Rower trying to get out, and she filed it away the way she filed away every half-answer a guilty man ever gave her in an interview, because in 3 years of newspaper work she had learned that the things men did not finish saying were nearly always the truest part of the sentence. "Where is he now?" she said. "My father. Where is his body?" "Still at the camp," David said, and she saw him brace himself even as the words left his mouth. "The camp office is holding him. There is a matter of a debt they claim he owed the company store, and until it is settled, they will not release him for burial. Something in Olive's chest that had been grief a moment before turned in an instant into something colder and far more useful. "Then I will go to Copper Creek Camp," she said, "and I will settle it myself." "It is a hard ride in good weather," David said. "In this snow alone at night it is close to a fool's errand." "My father is not a debt to be adjudicated by a company clerk," Olive said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He is my father, and he is owed a burial, and I intend to see that he gets one, tonight if the road allows it, and at first light if it does not. I did not come 400 miles to be told to wait in a hotel lobby." David studied her for a long moment, the way she remembered him studying a fence line for a break, patient and thorough, and then he said, "First light, then. I will take you up myself." "I did not ask for an escort, Sheriff." "No," he agreed. "You did not. I am offering one regardless. You can refuse it if you like and ride up there alone into a camp full of men who work for the company that is trying to take your father's land and see how far that gets you. Or you can let an old friend ride beside you and see how much farther that gets you instead." It was, she thought, exactly the kind of quietly stubborn logic the boy he had been would have used, dressed now in a man's low, steady voice, and despite everything, despite the grief that had not yet fully landed and would not for hours yet, she felt the corner of her mouth twitch towards something that was not quite a smile. "First light," she agreed. He was as good as his word. She woke before dawn in the narrow room Tucker had given her, from a sleep thin and full of her father's voice, and found David already waiting in the lobby with 2 horses saddled outside. His own bay and a sturdy gray mare he said belonged to the livery and answered to Dinah. The snow had stopped falling in the night but had left 4 inches on the ground, and the sky over the eastern ridges was the color of a fresh bruise, purple fading to a hard, clear yellow where the sun would soon come up. "You do not have to do this," Olive said, as they mounted. "I know that," David said, and did not elaborate, and they rode out of Larkspur together as the first true light of the day came up over Rattlesnake Ridge and turned the new snow the color of a struck match. The road to Copper Creek Camp climbed steadily through stands of lodgepole pine gone white and heavy under the snow, following the frozen switchbacks of the creek itself, and for the first hour neither of them spoke much beyond the practical business of the trail. Olive found with some surprise that she still rode as well as she ever had. Denver had not worn that out of her, whatever else it had changed. She had forgotten how much room there was in this country, how the mountains stood up on every side of the valley like the walls of some vast unroofed cathedral, and how small and human and urgent every trouble seemed against them, and yet somehow was not made smaller by the comparison. "Your father wrote to me," David said when they stopped to rest the horses at a bend where the creek ran black and open beneath a fringe of ice. "Twice this past summer." Olive turned in her saddle. "He did not tell me that. He would not have. He asked me not to make trouble of it, only to keep an eye on the company men when I could." David's jaw worked. "I told him I would. I did not do it well enough." "What did he write to you about?" "The Continental Valley Land and Improvement Company," David said, giving the name its full, absurd, respectable weight, "has been calling in mortgages that half the valley never signed. Forged paper, Olive. Deeds and liens got up to look like a man borrowed against his own land, when he never borrowed $1 in his life. When a farmer cannot produce a note he never took out to prove he does not owe it, the company forecloses, and the county recorder's office, which is supposed to catch exactly that kind of fraud, has been looking the other way." "Who runs the recorder's office?" "A man named Straub holds it for now, appointed after the last recorder died of the influenza in the spring. There is a special election in 9 days to fill the seat permanently. Straub is the company's man through and through, and Cornelius Straub winning that election is worth more to the Continental Valley Company than every mine claim in Copper Creek put together. And the ballot box we saved yesterday was on its way down from the Copper Creek precinct for the special election," David said. Early returns, cast by the miners who work claims up there and by the ranch families along the upper creek, most of whom despise the company and would as soon vote for a dog as for Straub. If that box had gone missing in a stagecoach robbery, along with every ballot in it, the company would have had a fine excuse to hold the vote again on their own schedule, in their own way. Olive felt the old, familiar quickening that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the particular hunger she had built her whole career around, the sense of watching the separate, scattered pieces of a lie begin to fit together into a shape. "And who funded your election, David?" She had not meant it as an accusation, only a journalist's honest question, but she saw it land on him like a slap regardless, and she understood before he answered that she had found the wound at the center of everything. "Harlan Voss," David said quietly. "He owns the bank, and a lawyer named Cornelius Straub, the same man now sitting the recorder's office. Between the two of them, they put up most of the money that got me elected sheriff last year, on the promise, unspoken but plain enough, that I would keep the peace their way. I did not know then what their way meant. I have been finding out ever since, a little at a time, and liking myself less with every piece of it." "And the night my father died," Olive said, "was that their way too?" David did not answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice had gone rough. "I do not fully know yet what happened that night," he said. "I mean to find out all of it, whatever it costs me. That is the only promise I have to give you, Olive, and I know it is a poor one against the size of what you have lost, but it is what I have." They rode the rest of the way to Copper Creek Camp mostly in silence, and Olive spent that silence turning his words over like a coin. She could not decide the value of grief and suspicion and something else, something warmer and more dangerous, tangled together so thoroughly she could not have separated them if she had tried. Copper Creek Camp announced itself first by smell, wood smoke and coal smoke, and the mineral bite of tailings, and then by sound, the constant clatter of a stamp mill somewhere up the gulch, and finally by sight, a raw scatter of log cabins and canvas tents and one long false-fronted street thrown up along the creek where the ground leveled out enough to build. It was smaller and meaner than Larkspur, populated by men in canvas coats stiff with frozen mud, and more than one of them turned to watch a woman ride in on a gray mare beside the county sheriff with open, unhurried curiosity. The camp office stood at the head of the street, a long log building with Copper Creek Mining and Supply painted across its front in letters gone gray with age. And behind its counter, when Olive pushed through the door with David a half-step behind her, stood a narrow, precise man in a black coat too clean for the camp around him, going through a ledger with the unhurried care of a man who enjoyed his own thoroughness. "I am Olive Redmond," she said before he could speak first. "I have come for my father's body." The man closed the ledger with a small, satisfied click. "Silas Prout," he said, "camp administrator. Your father, Miss Redmond, left an outstanding account with this company of some considerable size. Store credit tools, a mortgage note against his stock taken out against future claim earnings. Until that account is settled, company policy is plain on the matter of releasing the deceased." "My father never bought so much as a shovel from this company," Olive said. "He ranched cattle in the valley below. He had no claim up here to earn against." Prout's smile did not move. "The paper says otherwise, Miss Redmond." He laid a folded document on the counter, and Olive saw, even upside down, the shape of a signature at the bottom that was recognizably not her father's careful, cramped hand, though it had clearly been made to resemble it by someone with more confidence than skill. "That is a forgery," she said. "That is a serious accusation to make against a company of the Continental Valley standing," Prout said, "and I would advise a young woman traveling alone to consider her words with some care." "She is not traveling alone," David said, stepping up beside her, and something in his voice had gone flat and hard in a way Olive had not heard from him yet, not even at the stagecoach wreck. "I am the sheriff of this county, Mr. Prout, and I am telling you now, in front of witnesses, that you will release Elias Redmond's body to his daughter within the hour, or I will have this office searched top to bottom for every forged note you have got squirreled away in that ledger, and I will bring a federal marshal in to do it if I have to ride to Denver myself to fetch one." Pruitt's composure slipped, just slightly, at the word marshal. "Sheriff Watkins," he said, "I do not believe the company would appreciate." "I do not much care what the company appreciates," David said. "I have spent the better part of a year caring what the company appreciates, and I find I have run out of patience for it. Bring out Mr. Redmond's body, or bring out your books, and let us see which one you would rather explain to a marshal." There was a silence in the office broken only by the distant clatter of the stamp mill, and then Pruitt, with the air of a man recalculating a debt he had misjudged, called for two men to open the cold shed behind the office. Olive's father lay wrapped in canvas on a bench in a lean-to shed that smelled of frost and pine pitch, and when they folded the canvas back from his face, she found that grief, when it finally arrived in full, was not the sharp thing she had expected, but something enormous and quiet, like a held breath she had been holding for 2 weeks without knowing it. Elias Redmond's face in death looked smaller than she remembered it in life, the deep lines around his eyes gone smooth, and she stood over him for a long time with her hand pressed flat against his chest, saying nothing at all, while David stood a respectful distance back with his hat in his hands and let her have the silence. "He looks like he is only sleeping," she said finally. "He was a good man," David said quietly. "Whatever else happened that night, I know that much for certain, Olive. He was trying to help those miners and ranch families organize against the company, nothing more. He was not a man looking for trouble." "Tell me how he died," she said, not turning around. "The truth of it, David. I have read too many false reports in my life to be handled gently. I would rather have the whole of it, even if it is terrible, than a kindness with pieces missing." David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the careful evenness of a man laying down cards he had been holding close for a long time. "There was a meeting held in the miners' hall 2 weeks back," he said. "Ranchers from the valley and miners from the camp, near 60 men, talking about how to stand against the company's mortgage claims and get an honest man into the recorder's seat. Harlan Voss and Cornelius Straub sent word to me that an unlawful gathering was being held, armed and dangerous, and ordered me to break it up before it turned into a mob. Was it armed and dangerous? It was 60 tired men talking in a cold hall about deeds and debts," David said. "I know that now. I did not know it for certain then, not with the way it was described to me, and I rode up with 4 deputized men, Voss's own hired hands among them, a man named Frank Doyle chief among them, to break it up." He stopped, and when he went on his voice had gone lower. "It went wrong the moment we arrived. Somebody's gun went off. I still do not know whose first, and then it was dark and men were shouting and running every direction, and I fired a shot myself, Olive, at a shape running from the hall that I could not see clearly, because I believed I was being fired on and I was afraid. Your father was found the next morning 100 yards from that hall with a bullet in him. I do not know to this hour whether it was mine." Olive turned then finally to look at him, and found him standing with his hat crushed in both hands and his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, unable to meet hers, a man confessing a thing he had clearly been carrying alone for 2 weeks with no one to set it down beside. "You believe you may have killed my father," she said slowly, "and you rode me up here anyway. You stood beside me while I looked at his body. I would not have let you ride up here alone regardless of what I believe," David said. "But no, I would not have blamed you for refusing my company, knowing what I have just told you. I told you because you asked for the truth, and because I think you have spent enough of your life around men who tell you comfortable lies instead." She studied him for a long time, the falling light through the shed's one small window catching the gray beginning at his temples that had not been there 8 years ago, the scar through his eyebrow, the exhaustion behind his eyes of a man who had not slept easily in 2 weeks. And she found, to her own considerable surprise, that what she felt was not the hatred she might have expected to feel toward her father's possible killer, but something far more complicated, a kind of aching respect for the plain, unflinching way he had handed her the worst thing he knew about himself, rather than let her discover it second-hand. "I do not know yet what I feel about what you have told me," she said finally. "I expect I will need time to feel the whole of it, but I will tell you this, David Watkins. A guilty man protects himself. He tells half-truths and waits to see how much a woman already knows before he decides how much more to give her. You have just told me the worst of it before I asked twice. That is not nothing." "It is not enough, either," David said. "Whatever I am owed or not owed, your father is dead, and I mean to find out the whole truth of that night if I have to take this camp apart log by log to do it. Not for my own conscience's sake only, for his." They rode back down out of Copper Creek Camp with Olive Redmond's body wrapped in canvas and lashed behind David's saddle, the light already beginning to fail again, though it was barely past noon. Gray cloud building once more over the western ridges, with the particular heaviness that meant more snow before dark. They made it as far as the old line shack at Sawtooth Bend, a one-room trapper's cabin long since abandoned to hunters and travelers caught out by weather, before the snow came down thick enough that David called a halt, rather than risk the horses on the icy switchbacks in failing light. "We will lose the trail in another hour," he said, swinging down and testing the shack's door, which gave with a groan of old hinges. "Better to shelter here and go on at first light than to break a horse's leg in the dark for the sake of pride." Olive, cold through to the bone and grateful beyond words for a reason to stop moving, did not argue. They brought the horses in under the shack's lean-to roof out of the worst of the wind, and David built a small fire in the stone hearth from wood stacked dry inside the door by some considerate stranger months before, and for a long while they sat on opposite sides of that fire without speaking, the flames throwing shifting light across the rough log walls, her father's body wrapped and still and terrible just outside the door in the cold, where nothing would trouble it further before morning. "You have not asked me anything about my life these past 8 years, Olive said finally, watching the fire rather than him. "Most men would have by now, out of politeness if nothing else." "I did not think you wanted politeness from me," David said. "I thought you might want the truth, same as you asked of me up at the camp. And the truth is I have thought about writing to you 100 times since you left, and never once found the courage to send a letter, because I did not know what I would say that would not sound like a man begging a woman to come back to a life she had already chosen to leave." Olive looked up at that, startled by the plainness of it. "You could have asked me why I left." "I know why you left," David said. "Your mother had just died, and this valley had become a house full of her absence, and you wanted to be somewhere the world was larger than 100 acres of cattle and a father who could not say her name without his voice breaking. I do not blame you for it, Olive. I have spent 8 years wishing you had stayed, and not 1 hour of those 8 years thinking you were wrong to go." She had not expected that either, the generosity of it, and it undid something in her chest that she had kept carefully knotted for a long time. "I write for the Denver Clarion," she said, "because it was easier to speak of facts than feelings, at least at first. Land fraud mostly. Company towns and rigged claims and men in good coats who steal from farmers with a pen instead of a gun. I have testified twice before territorial commissions. I have been threatened by lawyers in 3 counties and shot at exactly once before yesterday by a mine owner's foreman outside Central City who did not appreciate my questions about his payroll." "You make it sound almost dull," said that plainly. "It is not dull," she admitted, and something like a real smile touched her mouth for the first time since the stagecoach had gone over. "It is the only thing I have ever done that made me feel the size of my own life. I did not know, when I left here, that I would find it in a newspaper office. I only knew I could not find it in this valley, not then." "And now?" David asked quietly. She did not answer that directly, not yet, because the honest answer frightened her a little, sitting across a fire from a man she had once carved into the whole shape of her girlhood future and then left behind on purpose. Instead she said, "Tell me about Frank Doyle." David's face closed slightly, the softness of a moment before folding back into the sheriff's careful watchfulness. "He works for Voss directly, not a deputy, not lawful in any sense, though Voss likes to dress his men up in a badge when it suits him. Doyle is the one who rides out when the company wants a debt collected with more force than paper allows. I believe he was at the miners' hall the night your father died, and I believe, though I cannot yet prove it, that he fired shots that night as freely as I did, and with far less excuse." "Then we find the proof," Olive said, and heard in her own voice the old newspaperwoman's certainty returning, steadying her against the grief that kept threatening to rise back up out of the quiet. "There will be a witness, David. There is always a witness. 60 men do not stand in a hall and then scatter into a dark field without at least one of them seeing something the others missed." "And if we find that witness," David said, "and if the truth points to Doyle and not to me, does that settle the matter for you? Or does it only shift the blame I still deserve to carry for leading men up that hill in the dark at Voss's word, whatever bullet did the actual killing?" "I do not know yet," Olive said honestly. "I told you I would need time to feel the whole of it. I am not going to pretend otherwise to make either of us more comfortable tonight." "I would not want you to," David said, and there was something in the quiet steadiness of it, the utter absence of any attempt to argue her into forgiving him faster than she was ready to, that settled something uneasy in her chest. They kept the fire going in turns through the night, since neither of them entirely trusted sleep, and it was somewhere in the small hours, with the snow hissing softly against the shack's one-shuttered window and the horses shifting and blowing in the lean-to outside, that Olive found herself telling him about the newspaperman in Denver who had courted her for the better part of a year, and whom she had refused, not because there was anything wrong with him, but because she had realized, turning down his offer, that she had spent 3 years comparing every man she met to the memory of a boy in a Larkspur schoolyard, and finding them all somehow insufficient, without ever once admitting to herself that was what she was doing. David was quiet for a long time after she said that. Then he said, "Lo, I was engaged once, 2 years back, a schoolteacher named Sarah Finch. She broke it off 6 months before the wedding, and when she told me why, she said I looked at her the way a man looks at a photograph of somewhere he used to live. I did not understand what she meant at the time. I believe I understand it a good deal better tonight." Neither of them said anything else for a long while after that. But something had shifted in the small, dark room. Some careful distance narrowed by an inch that neither of them tried to close further that night, both of them aware, without needing to say it, that there was a dead man wrapped in canvas outside the door and a whole valley's worth of danger still ahead of them, and that whatever was beginning between them deserved more than a stolen hour by a borrowed fire to become what it might become. They buried Olive Redmond 3 days later on a rise above his own ranch house, under a stand of bare cottonwoods, with the whole valley's worth of small ranch families come out through the snow to stand at the grave, because Olive Redmond had been well loved, and his death, however it had come, had frightened every family in Larkspur Valley who held a mortgage they had never signed for, and a deed they were no longer certain was safe. Olive stood at the graveside between David and a lean, weathered man named Tobias Hale, who had ridden for her father 11 years, and who had been at the miners' hall the night of the shooting, having gone up himself with a dozen ranch hands to stand with the miners against the company's men. "I saw your father go down, Miss Redmond," Tobias told her afterward, in the low, careful voice of a man who had turned a memory over so many times it had gone smooth as a river stone. "It was dark and there was smoke from somebody's fired gun hanging in the cold air, and I could not swear to whose shot it was in a courtroom. But I will tell you what I can swear to. Frank Doyle was standing not 30 feet from your father when he fell, with a rifle in his hands, and he did not so much as look down at the man he had likely killed before he turned and rode off up the gulch. The sheriff there, he nodded at David, was 100 yards off in the other direction on foot, shouting for men to hold their fire. I heard him shouting it myself, Miss Redmond, right before the last shots came. Olive felt David go very still beside her. "You never told me that," he said. "You never asked me plain, Sheriff," Tobias said, not unkindly. "And I did not know until I saw the way you have been carrying yourself around town this past fortnight that you needed telling." It was not proof, not the kind a courthouse would accept, but it was the first crack of daylight through a door Olive had begun to fear might never open, and she watched something in David's shoulders ease, just slightly, for the first time since she had met him again on the road above Larkspur Creek. The investigation, once properly begun, moved the way Olive had always found such investigations moved, in fits and small discoveries rather than any single dramatic revelation. She spent the days after the funeral riding the valley with David at her side more often than not, though never at her insistence, only because their errands kept overlapping in ways that felt, after a while, less like coincidence and more like two people who had simply stopped pretending they preferred to work alone. They found a bank clerk named Mabel Sutter who had worked Harlan Voss's ledgers for 6 years and who had begun, quietly and at considerable personal risk, keeping a second set of notes of her own, a private accounting of every mortgage she had been asked to notarize where the signature looked, to her practiced eye, subtly wrong. She had told no one, she said, because she had nowhere safe to tell it, and because she had a widowed mother to support and could not afford to lose her position on a suspicion she could not yet prove. She agreed, after 2 long evenings of careful conversation in her mother's kitchen, to let Olive copy her notes, on the promise that her name would not be spoken aloud until the matter came before a judge who could protect her from Voss's retaliation. They found, in the county surveyor's dusty back office, an assistant surveyor named Willis Cade who admitted, white-faced and sweating despite the cold, that he had been paid to redraw certain parcel boundaries along the upper creek to place valuable water frontage inside, claims the company wished to control, and who produced, from beneath a false bottom in his own desk drawer, the original survey stakes he had pulled up and hidden rather than destroy. Because some stubborn scrap of conscience in him had not been able to bring himself to burn the truth even while he helped bury it. And they found, at last, in the 3rd week of Olive's search, an old prospector named Amos Whitfield, half-deaf and mostly forgotten, who had been sleeping rough in a lean-to behind the miners' hall the night of the shooting because he had nowhere better to be, and who told Olive, in a voice gone thin with age but perfectly clear in its details, that he had watched from his blankets as Frank Doyle raised a rifle and fired twice into the dark at a running man he could not have properly identified, and that he had seen that same running man fall and not rise again. "I never told a soul," Amos said, "because Doyle came round after and told every man he could find sleeping that fool who talked would find himself sleeping a good deal longer than usual, if you understand me, Miss Redmond. I am 71 years old and do not scare easy anymore, having outlived most everything that used to frighten me. But I am telling you now because your father brought me coffee every cold morning for 11 winters running, when he had no earthly reason to trouble himself over an old fool camped on the edge of his land, and I owe his memory better than my silence." It was, Olive thought, listening to him, exactly the kind of testimony a good defense lawyer would try to pick apart in a courtroom, an old man's memory of a dark and chaotic night, uncorroborated by any other direct witness. But it was also, taken together with Tobias Hale's account and the strange, telling absence of any bullet wound in Elias Redmond's body consistent with the caliber of David's own revolver, which the camp doctor at Copper Creek confirmed for them in a written statement after Olive rode up a second time to ask him plainly, a chain of small truths strong enough, she began to believe, to hang together in front of the right judge. The reversal came on a night 10 days before the special election, when Olive returned to the small room she had taken above the mercantile to find her satchel of notes gone, the window forced, and a single word scrawled in charcoal across her looking-glass: "Leave." She did not scream, and her hands did not shake, though her heart was going hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. She went straight to the sheriff's office instead, 3 doors down, and found David still awake at his desk over a stack of correspondence, and told him plainly what had happened. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. "They know we have been gathering evidence," he said. "Voss would not risk this otherwise. He has been watching or paying someone to watch, and he has decided we are close enough to something to be worth frightening off. Or close enough to something to be worth silencing," Olive said. "Whichever it is, David, we are out of time to be careful about this. The election is in 10 days. If Straub is certified into that recorder's office, every forged mortgage Mabel Sutter has documented becomes lawful the moment his signature goes on the county seal. And there will be no undoing it afterward, not for years, not without a fight in territorial court that would bankrupt half the families in this valley before it ever finished." "Then we do not wait 10 days, David said. "We take what we have to Judge Corwin now, tonight if he will see us, and we ask for a hearing before the election, not after." Judge Corwin, a dry, careful man of 60 who had ridden circuit through 6 counties for 20 years and had, Olive suspected from the first 10 minutes of their meeting, long harbored his own private suspicions about Harlan Voss's businesses, agreed to hear a preliminary petition in 3 days' time, on the condition that Olive and David bring every witness and every scrap of physical proof they possessed, and be prepared to have all of it tested hard in open court. It was on the second of those 3 nights, standing watch together over Mabel Sutter's ledger and Willis Cade's recovered survey stakes, locked now in the sheriff's own strong room with David sleeping in the office rather than leave the evidence unguarded, that the last wall between them finally came down. Olive had offered to take the second half of the night watch, unwilling to leave David to stand guard alone after 2 sleepless nights already, and they sat together in the small back room with a single lamp turned low, the strongbox between their chairs like a chaperone neither of them entirely trusted to do its job. "I have been afraid of something," David said into the quiet, "since the night your father died that I have not said aloud to anyone, not even to Judge Corwin." "Say it now," Olive said. "I'm afraid that whatever this hearing decides about whose bullet killed Olive Redmond," he said, "I will still have to live the rest of my life knowing I rode up that hill at Voss's word, in the dark, against 60 men who had done nothing but talk about their own land in their own hall, and that I fired my weapon into that dark not because I was certain of a threat, but because I was frightened and had been told to expect one. A judge may clear me of the killing. I do not know that I will ever entirely clear myself of the raid." Olive was quiet for a long moment, watching the lamplight move on his face. "I have spent 3 years writing about men who did far worse than that, David, and felt not one shred of the difficulty forgiving them that I feel with you," she said finally. "I used to think that meant I had gone soft coming home. I have decided instead it means I finally recognize the difference between a man who does a wrong thing because he enjoys the doing of it, and a man who does a wrong thing because better men lied to him about what he was doing, and who has not stopped trying to undo it since the moment he learned the truth. That is a kinder measure of me than I have been taking of myself." "Then let me hold that measure for both of us a while longer," Olive said, "until you are able to hold it yourself." He looked at her then with an expression she remembered, with a jolt, from a summer evening 8 years gone, the 2 of them sitting on the top rail of her father's corral fence with their shoulders barely touching, both too young and too frightened of the size of what they felt to say anything about it at all. "I have loved you since I was 17 years old, Olive Redmond," David said now plainly, the way he seemed to say everything that mattered most. "I loved you the whole 8 years you were gone, though I never let myself call it that in so many words, because it seemed a foolish thing to carry for a woman who had made her life 400 miles away and given me no reason to believe she would ever want it carried. I do not know how to say it any more carefully than that, and I have decided, sitting in this room with you 3 nights running, that I no longer wish to try. Olive set down the pen she had been holding, and found her voice had gone unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with fear of Voss's men or the hearing 3 days off. I left this valley because I could not see a future in it large enough to hold everything I wanted to become, she said. I have spent 3 years proud of that decision. I am not sorry for it even now, but I will tell you the truth I have been circling since the moment you rode down off that ridge above the stagecoach wreck. Whatever future I am building, David, I find I do not want to build it 400 miles away from you any longer. I do not know yet what shape that takes. I only know I do not want to leave this valley again without you in whatever comes next. He crossed the small space between their chairs slowly, as though giving her every chance to stop him, and when she did not, he took her face in both hands, careful as a man handling something he could not afford to break, and kissed her. It was not a kiss like the fumbling, hopeful things they had traded as children behind her father's barn. It was slower than that and surer, carrying in it 8 years of separate roads and a grief they had walked through together, and a whole valley's worth of danger still ahead of them. And when it ended, Olive found she was laughing softly, not because anything was funny but because some enormous weight she had not known she was carrying had simply come loose. "That is a poor time to be laughing in the middle of a night watch," David said, though he was smiling too. "It is the best time I have had in 2 weeks, Olive said. I intend to enjoy it, Sheriff Watkins, whatever Harlan Voss thinks he can still do about it." Voss, as it turned out, had a great deal in mind about what he could still do about it. The next morning, riding out to Mabel Sutter's mother's house to collect a final sworn copy of the bank ledgers for the hearing, Olive and David found the road blocked by 4 riders under a stand of bare cottonwoods, Frank Doyle at their head on a heavy black gelding, a rifle across his saddle in a posture that made its purpose plain without a word being said. "Sheriff," Doyle said, with the false, easy courtesy of a man who had said far worse things in far worse tones, "Mr. Voss thought you and the lady might benefit from an escort back to town. He is concerned for your safety, given the roads these days." "Mr. Voss's concern is noted," David said, his hand resting easy near his revolver without quite drawing it, and declined. "We have business of our own this morning." "I expect that business concerns a certain ledger," Doyle said, "belonging to a certain young woman who has been talking a great deal more than is healthy for her these past weeks." Olive felt her pulse climb but kept her voice level, the reporter's trick of sounding calmer than she felt. "If you mean to rob us of paperwork in broad daylight, Mr. Doyle, in front of a sitting sheriff, I confess I am curious how you intend to explain that to Judge Corwin." "I do not intend to rob anybody," Doyle said. "I intend to have a quiet word with Mrs. Sutter's daughter about the wisdom of testifying to things she misunderstood in another woman's ledgers. Nothing more." "You will not go near Mabel Sutter," David said, and his voice had dropped into that same flat, hard register Olive had heard once before, in Silas Pruitt's office. "You will turn your horse around, Doyle, and ride back to Voss, and you will tell him that if one hair on that woman's head is disturbed between now and the hearing, I will personally see every charge this county can bring laid against him, starting with obstruction and ending wherever a judge cares to take it." For a long, taut moment nobody moved, the wind stirring the bare cottonwood branches overhead, and Olive found herself calculating, with the cold practicality of a woman who had faced down angry men before, exactly how fast she could get her own small pistol out of her coat pocket if it came to that. It did not come to that. Doyle, weighing 4 riders against 1 sheriff and 1 armed woman, and the certain knowledge that killing either of them in broad daylight 10 days before a hearing would bring exactly the scrutiny his employer most wanted to avoid, finally spat into the snow and wheeled his horse around. "Voss will not forget this, Sheriff," he said. "You have made your choice plain enough now. I hope you are prepared to live with where it leaves you." "I have been living with worse for 2 weeks already," David said. "I find I sleep a good deal easier with the choice made plainly than I ever did trying to serve two masters at once." They watched Doyle and his men ride off up the ridge, and only once they were well out of sight did Olive let out the breath she had been holding. "That was not an idle threat," she said. "He will try again before the hearing." "Men like Voss do not fold because a sheriff speaks sternly to them once." "No," David agreed, "which means we do not wait for a second attempt. We move Mabel Sutter and her mother into town under guard tonight, and we lodge every scrap of evidence we have with Judge Corwin himself rather than keep it another night in my strong room, however good a lock it has." They spent that day and the next in a kind of controlled, purposeful motion that reminded Olive, oddly, of the best newsroom nights she had known in Denver. Deadline pressing close, and every hand needed at once. Moving Mabel Sutter and her frightened, brave mother into a guarded room above the Mercantile. Riding out to fetch Amos Whitfield and Willis Cade and Tobias Hale, all of whom agreed, some more readily than others, to appear before Judge Corwin in person. And finally, on the morning of the third day, walking together up the frozen steps of the Larkspur County Courthouse, with a leather satchel of ledgers and survey stakes and sworn statements between them, to find the courtroom already half full and the air thick with the particular electric hush of a town that knew, without quite being told, that something was about to be decided. Harlan Voss sat near the front in a good gray coat, composed and unhurried, with Cornelia Straub beside him in the borrowed dignity of a man who still believed the office he had not yet legally won belonged to him already. Frank Doyle stood near the back wall with two of his riders, arms crossed, watching David with an expression that promised trouble the moment the law's protection thinned. Judge Corwin gavelled the room to order and looked out over it with the flat, patient attention of a man who had presided over a great many disputes and had learned not to be impressed by the confidence of the wealthy. "This is a preliminary hearing," he said, "called on petition to examine allegations of fraud touching the county recorder's office and the conduct of the special election, now 9 days concluded from initial petition, and due to certify results within the week. I will hear testimony and examine evidence, and I will decide at the end of it whether there is cause to delay certification and refer this matter for full prosecution. Miss Redmond, Sheriff Watkins, you brought this petition. You may proceed." Olive rose and found her hand steady despite the weight of every eye in the room upon her, because she had stood in front of hostile rooms before, and because David rose beside her, close enough that she could feel the solid, certain warmth of him even without touching him, and that steadiness carried her the first few sentences until her own professional composure took over entirely. "Your Honor," she said, "I will show this court that the Continental Valley Land and Improvement Company, through its agent Harlan Voss and its recorder appointee Cornelia Straub, has for the better part of a year conducted a systematic fraud against the ranch families of Larkspur Valley, using forged mortgage instruments to seize land those families never borrowed against, with the intent of consolidating water rights and grazing land for resale to Eastern investors at considerable profit." She called Mabel Sutter first, and watched the courtroom's attention sharpen as the young clerk, pale but steady, laid out 6 years of private notes documenting signatures she had been asked to notarize that did not match the true hands of the men who supposedly signed them, comparing them page by page against genuine documents Olive had gathered from the ranch families themselves. Straub's lawyer objected repeatedly to the comparison as speculative. Judge Corwin overruled him twice and allowed it once, noting dryly that a court was entitled to use its own eyes. She called Willis Cade next, who confessed, in a halting voice, to redrawing survey boundaries at Voss's direction, and produced the original stakes he had hidden rather than burned, their positions matching precisely the true boundaries the ranch families had always understood their land to hold, boundaries that had somehow shifted on paper, though never on the ground, in the company's favor. Then came the matter of Olive Redmond, and here the courtroom's hush deepened further, because everyone in Larkspur County knew by now whose daughter stood before the judge, and what the answer to this part of the hearing might mean for the sheriff standing beside her. Tobias Hale testified first to what he had seen and heard at the miners' hall, and to David's shouted orders to hold fire heard from 100 yards distant at the moment the fatal shots were fired. Amos Whitfield followed, his old voice thin but unwavering, describing in plain, unembellished detail how he had watched Frank Doyle raise a rifle in the dark and fire twice at a running man who did not rise again. Straub's lawyer, growing desperate, pressed Amos hard on his age, his eyesight, the darkness of the night, the confusion of the moment, and Amos answered every question with the same unhurried patience of a man who had nothing left to lose by telling the truth slowly and carefully. "I am old, sir, not blind," Amos said, to a ripple of quiet laughter that even Judge Corwin did not entirely suppress. "I have slept behind that hall 11 years. I know every shadow in that yard better than I know my own hands. I know what I saw." The camp doctor's written statement from Copper Creek, read into the record by the court clerk, confirmed that the wound which had killed Olive Redmond had come from a heavier caliber rifle, consistent with Frank Doyle's Winchester, striking from behind and to the side, a trajectory inconsistent with David's service revolver, and the angle from which David himself had fired that night, a fact the doctor had noted at the time, but had never been asked to explain to anyone in authority. It was at this point that Doyle, standing near the back wall, understanding at last exactly how thoroughly the ground had shifted beneath him, made the mistake of his life. He shoved forward through the gathered spectators toward the door, and when a deputy moved to block him, he drew. The shot went into the ceiling, plaster raining down onto the front benches, and for one terrible second the courtroom dissolved into shouting and scrambling bodies, women pulling children down behind benches, men shoving toward the exits. David was already moving, faster than Olive had ever seen a man move, closing the distance and driving his shoulder into Doyle's gun arm before a second shot could go anywhere at all, the two of them going down together in a tangle of overturned benches, while the deputy and two other men piled on to pin Doyle flat against the courthouse floor. It was over in perhaps 10 seconds, no one struck by the wild first shot, David rising afterward with a split lip and his coat torn at the shoulder but otherwise whole, and Olive found she had crossed half the courtroom without deciding to move, her hands going to his face before either of them could think better of it in front of half the county. "I am well," David said, low, seeing her expression. "Olive, I am well. You will forgive me for not entirely believing you until I have looked you over myself," she said, and heard, behind her, Judge Corwin's gavel restoring the room to something like order, and beneath that, the murmuring beginning among the spectators, the particular hum of a town watching a lie finally come apart in front of it. Doyle, hauled upright between two deputies, his gun arm bent awkwardly behind him, said nothing at all, but his silence told the room everything his testimony would have denied. Judge Corwin waited until the benches were righted and the room had settled before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had heard enough to decide. "I find," he said, "sufficient credible evidence of fraud in the conduct of mortgage instruments filed against the ranch families of this valley to void every disputed lien presented to this court today, pending full prosecution of the Continental Valley Land and Improvement Company and its agents. I further find sufficient credible evidence that the special election for county recorder was conducted under conditions of intimidation unfit for certification, and I am ordering that election set aside and a new election held under territorial marshal supervision within 30 days. Mr. Straub, You are relieved of the recorder's office as of this hour, pending the outcome of criminal proceedings against you for your role in these frauds. Mr. Voss, I expect you and your attorneys in this courtroom Monday morning to answer for the whole of it." Voss, who had sat through the entire hearing with the same unhurried composure, rose at last, his face gone the particular gray of a man watching a fortune collapse in real time, and left the courtroom without a word, his lawyer scrambling after him. "As to the matter of Olive Redmond's death," Judge Corwin continued, and the room quieted further still, "the testimony and physical evidence presented today establish, to this court's satisfaction, that the fatal shot was fired by Frank Doyle, acting under Harlan Voss's direction to disperse a lawful gathering by unlawful force. Sheriff Watkins, the evidence does not support that your own discharge of your weapon that night caused Mr. Redmond's death. It does establish that you participated, under false representations from Voss and Straub as to the nature of the gathering, in an unlawful raid that should never have been ordered and should never have been carried out. This court takes note of your conduct since that night, your cooperation in bringing this fraud to light at considerable personal risk, and your candor before this bench today. I will refer the matter of your own conduct that night to the county commission for review, and I will note for their consideration that a man who compounds an error by spending every hour since in pursuit of the truth, at the cost of the very men who put him in office, is not the same as a man who compounds an error by hiding it." David stood very still through this, and Olive, watching him, saw something ease in him that she suspected had been clenched tight since the night in the shed at Copper Creek Camp when he had first confessed his fear to her, a fear that had turned out in the end to be a wound he need not have carried alone, or carried at all. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said quietly when the judge finished, and it was the plainest, most naked gratitude Olive had ever heard in his voice. Frank Doyle was bound over for trial on charges of murder and obstruction. Straub was arrested where he stood. Harlan Voss, though he would spend the next several months contesting every finding through every lawyer his fortune could still afford, never again set foot in Larkspur County's recorder's office, and the Continental Valley Land and Improvement Company's Eastern investors, reading the territorial newspapers' accounts of the hearing over the following weeks, began quietly and rapidly withdrawing their capital rather than see it associated any further with fraud and murder both. Olive wrote the whole of it for the Denver Clarion, a long, careful piece that ran across 4 columns of the front page and was reprinted within the month in newspapers as far away as Chicago, and she wrote, at the very end of it, a line she had not planned to write until it came out of her almost on its own: that the truest justice in Larkspur Valley had not come from a courtroom alone, but from ordinary people, an old prospector, a frightened bank clerk, a guilt-ridden surveyor, a ranch hand who had loved his employer, who had each found in their own quiet way more courage than the powerful men who had counted on their silence. The new election, held 30 days later under the calm, careful supervision of a territorial marshal, returned an honest recorder to office by a margin so wide it was barely worth the counting, a rancher named Otis Greer who had lost 40 acres to a forged mortgage himself, and had spent the intervening weeks becoming, without much intending to, the valley's most trusted man. Snow had fallen twice more by then, each storm gentler than the first, and the valley had settled into the particular hush of a Colorado winter fully arrived, the cottonwoods along the creek bare, and silvered with frost, smoke rising straight and steady from 100 chimneys across land that families now held with clean paper and clear titles for the first time in a year. David found Olive on the rise above her father's ranch house, at Olive Redmond's grave, on the evening after the new recorder's election had been certified, standing bundled against the cold with her breath rising white in the last light, and he came to stand beside her without a word, the way he had learned to do, offering his presence rather than his questions. "I have had 2 offers this week," Olive said after a while. "The Clarion wants me back in Denver to run the paper's territorial desk. And Otis Greer, of all people, asked me yesterday whether I would consider starting a newspaper here in Larkspur, now that the valley has a story worth the telling that is not all fraud and grief." "What will you tell them?" David asked carefully, the question of a man who wanted very badly to know the answer and was trying not to let that wanting tip the scale unfairly. "I have already told the Clarion no," Olive said. "I find I have grown tired of writing other people's valleys, David, when I have one of my own worth defending. I mean to tell Otis Greer yes, if he is still in earnest about it, and build something here that outlasts men like Voss the next time they come, because they will come again, in some new shape, sooner or later. Someone ought to be watching when they do." David let out a breath she had not realized he was holding. "I was re-elected sheriff this morning, properly this time, by a county that voted for me without a dollar of company money changing hands to make them do it. I mean to keep that badge a good while yet, and to keep it honestly, whatever it costs me. I find I would like very much to keep it in the same valley where you mean to build your newspaper, Olive Redmond, if you will have me alongside it." She turned to look at him fully then, the last of the daylight catching gold in his eyes, and found that whatever grief still lived in her over her father's grave had settled, at last, into something she could carry rather than something that threatened to carry her under, and that the man standing beside it, who had once feared he might be the reason for that grief, and had spent every hour since proving himself worthy of forgiveness rather than demanding it, was not a burden she was accepting out of pity or loneliness, but a future she wanted with her whole clear-eyed heart. "I have loved you twice in my life, David Watkins," she said. "Once as a girl who did not yet know what she wanted, and once now, as a woman who knows exactly what she wants and finds, to her own considerable relief, that it looks a great deal like you." "Then marry me," David said, simply, without ceremony, the way he seemed to say the things that mattered most. "Not because this valley needs a sheriff and a newspaperwoman married to each other for the sake of tidiness, but because I have loved you the whole of my adult life without ever once expecting to have you, and I find I no longer wish to go on loving you at that distance when you are standing close enough to touch." "Yes," Olive said, and the word came out of her without a single moment's hesitation, clear and certain as the cold evening air around them. "Yes, David, I will marry you." He kissed her there above her father's grave, gently, the falling dusk settling blue and soft over the valley below them, the lights of Larkspur beginning to show one by one along the frozen creek, and Olive thought, standing in the circle of his arms with the whole wide, difficult, beautiful valley spread out beneath them, that she had ridden into these mountains 400 miles, and a lifetime ago looking only for her father's body and the truth of how he died, and had found instead, in the very last place she expected it, a man's redemption, and within it, entirely without meaning to, the whole of her own future besides. They were married in the spring, in the yard of the rebuilt Redmond ranch house, under cottonwoods just beginning to leaf, with Tobias Hale standing witness and Mabel Sutter throwing the first handful of early wildflowers, and Otis Greer, honest recorder of Larkspur County, filing the marriage record himself with a broad, unhurried smile, in a ledger that, for the first time in longer than anyone in the valley cared to remember, everyone present could trust completely. The Larkspur Valley Sentinel, Olive Redmond Watkins's newspaper, printed its first issue that same week, its lead story an account of the valley's honest election and the fraud that had nearly stolen it, and its final line, written in Olive's own steady hand, read simply, "Some debts, once paid in full and honest daylight, leave nothing owing behind them but peace."